Hi everyone, for today's lesson we are going to learn about rigid motion and congruence. Our learning targets for today are for you to be able to say, I can explain what it means for two figures to be congruent, and I can use congruence to solve for missing sides and missing angle measures. So for today's lesson, you will need the following items. You will need some colors, you will need something to write with, you will need to have printed out the unit for day 2 interactive notebook cutouts. And fortunately for this lesson, there's only one cutout, and that is translated triangles. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So in our I can statements, we want to be able to explain what it means for two figures to be congruent. So, and also look at the title, rigid motion. So remember, we had a whole unit about rigid transformations. And rigid transformations, remember, that was translations, reflections, and rotations. So we took figures and we moved them and we flipped them and we kept the size and the shape the same. So we're just going to be talking about how two different figures, even though they're in a different location, they are still considered congruent, and we're going to explain why that is true. And the other piece that we will talk about is how we're going to use the fact that two shapes are congruent to help us to find missing sides and angles. So there's going to be opportunities for us in this lesson, not necessarily the vocab notebook, but also in this lesson where we are going to have problems and we'll have to match everything up. This is a matching game. So I want you guys just to know this. It is a matching game. It's all about the statement and matching what you see in the statement with the picture. Now, in order for two figures to be congruent, so we're talking about figures. That means that we might be talking about triangles or pentagons or hexagons. In order for any two figures to be considered congruent to each other, they must be exactly the same shape, so I have they must be exactly the same shape and size. So in order for two figures to be congruent, they must be exactly the same shape and they must be exactly the same size. So that is really, really important. They have to be the same shape and size. If they're not, then they're not considered congruent. So this means that all parts, that means sides and angles, those are the parts that make up shapes. So all of the parts of one figure must match exactly to its corresponding part. In the other figure. Now, the key word here is they must match exactly to its corresponding part in the other figure. Corresponding. Remember, we used that when we were talking about corresponding angles. Whenever we had corresponding angles when we had parallel lines, they were congruent to each other. And I referred to the word corresponding as in a similar position or matching. And corresponding in this unit represents matching part. It matches. So they will line up with each other. We know that they will match up to each other. So what we're going to be doing in this unit is we have to show or prove we must show, which means that we are going to be proving and doing proofs, not necessarily in this lesson, but in this unit. We must show or prove that every angle and every side on one figure has an exact match on a second figure. So we must show or prove that every angle and every side on one figure has an exact match on a second figure. So that's what we have to show in this unit. This is what we are going to be starting off with in this lesson. I have to go ahead and flip the page because my cutout, it's going to be too big. So I'm going to flip the page. And I would like you guys to please go ahead and paste this cutout directly into your notebook. Okay, so what we have here is we have two triangles, triangle ABC and triangle GEO, and they have been translated. So triangle ABC, when it is shifted, becomes triangle GEO. Now looking at these triangles, what do you notice about the triangles as a whole? Are they the same or are they different? Hopefully you should see that for the most part, these triangles have the same shape and size. So by the eye, you would say that they have to be congruent to each other. Now, the next one says, what type of parts is the triangle made up of? So if we're talking about types of parts, remember that parts are sides and angles. So it's made up of angles and sides. And how many of each type are there? Well, there are a total of 6 parts. There are 3 angles and 3 sides. And it sounds very basic, but in terms of parts, a triangle has 6 total parts. So what we want to do now is, because we know that this triangle has been translated or shifted over, letter C is asking, to complete the following congruency statements. So congruency statements means that we are talking about what parts have to match up and are congruent to each other. So we're going to complete the following congruency statements by listing the congruent corresponding parts. That means we're looking at the parts that match up. So looking at angle A is right here. What would angle A match with in the second triangle? Hopefully you see that angle A would have to match with angle G. So we would say angle A is congruent to angle G. And angle B, that would have to match up with angle E. And angle C would have to match up with angle O. So in terms of our congruency statements, we have A is congruent to angle G, angle B is congruent to angle E, angle C is congruent to angle O, and that's dealing with your angles. Now we have to match up our sides. Looking at segment AB needs to be congruent to, so segment AB is this segment right here, and it would match with segment GE. So it's really important here. Now this is where we have to be very, very specific with how we write our statements. A matches with G, so you have to put G first. And B matches with E, so that means that E has to go second. You cannot say segment EG because it's all about matching. So it's a matching game. There's the only statement that is true that you're allowed to use is segment AB matches with segment GE. So now we're going to look at segment BC. Segment BC matches with segment EO. B matches with E, C matches with O, so our statement has to be EO. BC is congruent to segment EO. You cannot say OE because O does not match up with B. E matches up with B. So this is our only statement. The next one that we have is segment CA. And segment CA matches up with segment OG. So this is the only way that we're allowed to make this statement. C matches with O, so O would have to go first. And A matches with G, so G has to go second. It's all about what is written, and it's really important that whenever you're matching, that you are very, very diligent and specific with how you match. Otherwise, you'll get the answer wrong. So looking at letter D, it says, the following is one possible congruent statement. A congruent statement is where you are writing that the shape, in this case is triangle, ABC is congruent to triangle GEO. This is a congruent statement. A congruent statement, if we're talking about other shapes, it doesn't have a symbol in front, but for triangles, it means triangle something is congruent to triangle another thing. And there are 6 total statements that we can write. So a congruent statement, that one possible congruent statement is triangle ABC is congruent to triangle GEO. Let's go ahead and come up with all of the other ones. I'm going to say triangle ACB this time would have to be congruent to triangle A matches with G, C matches with O, and B matches with E. So triangle GOE. The third statement is where we would say triangle, and instead of A going first, we can have B go first. BAC would be congruent to triangle. Well, B matches with E, so E has to go first. A matches with G, so G has to go second. And C matches with O, EGO. Our next congruent statement would be that triangle BCA is congruent to triangle, well, B matches, looking at the statement, matches with E, C matches with O, and A matches with G, EOG. There's another statement that we could say. Triangle CAB would be congruent to triangle C matches with O, A matches with G, and B matches with E. Triangle OGE. And finally, triangle CBA would be congruent to triangle C matches with O, B matches with E, and A matches with G, OEG. And these are the 6 congruent statements that we can say about our triangle that we have up above. And you will be responsible for being able to write not just one, but multiple congruent statements based on different figures. And that is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions over anything that I just talked about, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.